and I'm the host now. All right, so just a quick thing. I am also on an incredibly slow internet connection here, and so it sometimes overwhelms the computer or our bandwidth if I try to share my video in addition to sharing my PowerPoint. So I'm going to stop my video and disappear from here, but what will take my place will be the PowerPoint. So let me do that now and stop my video and share my screen. All right. And I can still see you all. Can you just nod at me if you can see my PowerPoint? Great, perfect. It's been 100% so far, but I always just like to make sure. So thank you all so much for having me speak to your club tonight. Hopefully someday I get to actually see you in person. And so I got into beekeeping, several years ago, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But as comes out, I guess, annually, when you're a member of the State Beekeepers Association, is the request for someone for if you have a talk that you would like to present to clubs, for you to sort of throw your name in the hat along with your topic. And so I've done a lot of public speaking sort of over the course of my career as a veterinarian. And I thought that it would be really fun to have the ability to blend how much I love public speaking with my love of my profession as a veterinarian and my deep love of my hobby of beekeeping. So I bring to you tonight the veterinarian's role in beekeeping, now with case study. So our agenda for this evening, I'm going to talk a little bit about myself. That will more or less serve as my introduction, my backstory. We'll then transition over to trying to draw some parallels between bees and small cows. And as a bit of trivia, in veterinary medicine, especially when you're going through vet school, we have a saying says cats are not small dogs, and that is because cats are quite different from dogs, particularly from a medical standpoint. So instead of trying to convince you that bees are not small cows, I actually want to convince you that they kind of are. I'll talk then about the veterinarian's role in beekeeping and how we sort of got to this place where veterinarians are actually an integral part of this, this I guess, practice. And then the case study, experience the best teacher. So it'll be a review of something that we got to encounter firsthand this year in our apiary. So who is Rebekah? Well, I'm a doctor of veterinary medicine. I pretty much always wanted to be a vet and went into vet school thinking that I wanted to be a swine vet. I really enjoyed production animal medicine. I majored in animal science in undergrad, and I liked production animal medicine. I liked sort of like the epidemiology of it. I liked the aspect of statistics with it. And I guess I liked sort of the orally process of it. But as I went through vet school, I decided that I actually didn't want to be a swine vet for various reasons, partly because I didn't have a tremendous background in it other than just loving production animal medicine. And so for the next about 3 years of vet school, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And of all the classes that I took, it was actually my pathology classes that I loved the most. I remember waking up in the morning literally excited to go to school. Like I could not wait to get there and learn things. And I mean, I like learning, but like that level of interest I had never experienced before. So I ended up, after I finished vet school, I moved to Gainesville, Florida, and did a residency in in veterinary pathology at the University of Florida, and came out the other end of that, passed my boards, and became a diplomate of the American College of Veterinary Pathologists. So pathologists study disease, and we usually work in some sort of a laboratory setting. I work for a large private diagnostic company. I read needle biopsies, and I look at blood smears and do a few other things, and mostly look at samples that your vet might collect from your dogs and cats. We see a smattering of various other types of animals, which kind of makes my life interesting. And then in 2016, I got into beekeeping, and I sort of got into it by accident. And as it happened, there was a gentleman and his wife who were moving to Idaho, and they were selling their chickens in the coops and sort of, it was like a ready-made little, family farm type thing. And I had really wanted chickens, so I contacted him. And in the course of this, he happened to mention that he was also going to be selling his bees. And I said to myself, well, my husband was always really interested in bees. And so he convinced me to get the bees as part of this package deal. Wait for this, you'll laugh, because bees were most certainly easier to take care of than chickens. So yes, right? Hilarious. No, it's the black pit of the wallet, at least so far. So anyway, in our innocence, we came home with chickens and bees, and it's sort of been a love affair ever since. So I'm also a member of the Chatham County Beekeepers Association and also the North Carolina Association. I'm so thankful for the reminder to renew my dues. I will do that as soon as I get off of this, this webinar this evening. And I'm also a member of the Honeybee Veterinary Consortium. I'll talk a little bit about this organization later and sort of how it came about. But basically, this is an organization that's made up of students and professionals from sort of all different segments of veterinary medicine and animal science that basically pull together to really promote good beekeeping and to serve as sort of that liaison between beekeepers and apiary inspectors and veterinarians. It also is really excellent at providing sort of good quality continuing education seminars for veterinarians. So now we'll transition over to trying to convince you that bees are small cows. So we tend to think about bees as being a superorganism. So a colony is sort of the entity that is equivalent to a cow. Cows are made of various cells like blood cells and nerve cells and muscle cells and sort of all the other different cells that come together. And a colony is made up of all the individual bees, the worker bees, the drones when it's in season, and of course the queen, that pull together to make a superorganism. Honeybees provide things that are consumed by humans, including honey, wax, pollen. Propolis is also used in some aspects, and then also venom is a little bit, it's becoming more of a sort of trendy thing, especially in the cosmetics industry. And cattle also provide things that humans consume, meat and milk primarily. And then both honeybees and cattle are managed animals, managed by humans. And so I have these two images to sort of show, like what is probably the, more common scenario. In the upper right, that's actually me on the right with one of my dear friends who's also a pathologist. We work together on the left, and she just started beekeeping this year. And I like to think that you're not a truly successful beekeeper until you have succeeded in getting someone else to drink the Kool-Aid and jump down the rabbit hole and start beekeeping with you. So she just started this year. You can see sort of like how when people have their first child, it's doted upon. She has these beautiful like painted hives that she spent a lot of time on. And then in the bottom right, we have just, sort of like an image of the family farm of, might have a few cattle, that maybe it's a little side business. And then we transition into this slide, which shows sort of the other end of the spectrum, both the commercial apiary at the top, and then at the bottom, we've got a feedlot. And we obviously understand that it's going to be very different how we go managing bees, when you have, sort of like the hobbyist number of bees, maybe between like 5 and 15, versus a commercial beekeeper who's going to probably have like 200 plus colonies. Very different management styles. And the same thing also, when you're dealing with a feedlot type situation where you've got, hundreds of cattle versus, maybe like 5 that you're raising for market or possibly, personal consumption. So both honeybees and cattle forage for food, but the challenge is that honeybees do so without the confines of fencing. And so as a result, it's really challenging to limit what they are exposed to, both as far as pesticides and as far as other diseases. That's why we can't really eradicate varroa mites. It's just not, possible unless you ended up in such a confined area that, they wouldn't be susceptible to reinfection. Um, Honeybee colonies are often transported for long distances, and of course we probably think immediately about pollination services, but also nukes and packages. Georgia, as you know, is a very large supplier of nukes and packages because it gets a little bit warmer, a little bit sooner down there, and the environment, the climate is more conducive to getting those queens mated early and providing them for sale. And then, of course, cattle are also transported during the rearing process, especially with these commercial operations. So we have here a picture of a farmer who is loading some cattle up onto a truck and is going to move them somewhere. And it's a pretty stressful actual experience for the cattle as they're moved across the country. You know, they suffer from or they endure, you know, sort of stressors like, you know, lack of food or water, you know, at least not having it readily accessible at all times. You know, they're stuck in these trailers, and then, you know, they become heated and chilled, and it's just it is a component of commercial production. But notwithstanding, it's still pretty stressful for the animals. And if you know anything about cattle, you know that there's sort of an entity of diseases that they get when they're stressed called sort of collectively shipping fever. It's not a specific thing, but this typically is something that happens when the animals are stressed and their bodies maybe aren't as good at fighting off an infection that they otherwise could. And so I think, you know, we sort of see some of this being a similar scenario with bees as well, moved across the country. And I mean, that has to be stressful for them. You know, they neither cattle nor bees, you know, are meant to be migratory animals like this. And so we see with on the left, we've got, you know, the sort of the commercial pollinator following what happens to be in bloom, whether it's the almonds in California or the citrus in Florida or blueberries in Maine. We move bees quite a bit. And as a result, bees are, you know, typically exposed to other bees from other places. And so it becomes a really ripe environment for spreading disease. So I tried to find just the most wholesome image of honey that I possibly could. Like, this makes my mouth water to look at it. It's beautiful. And a lot of us, you know, we beekeep for various reasons, but I think all of us probably enjoy honey, and we sort of think of it as maybe like this really like wholesome, wonderful product. And it is. It is actually nature's antibiotic. Honey has a really low pH, and it also has hydrogen peroxide, and it has a high sugar content. And all of those things impart an antimicrobial antibiotic property of honey. And as has probably been your experience, as soon as you open your mouth and someone finds out that you are a beekeeper, they want to tell you some story about bees or honey or something else. And so I was at a veterinary conference several years ago, and I think I had just started beekeeping. And, you know, the other thing they always ask is if you have honey for sale. Everyone asks you this. But anyway, so there was a veterinarian, and we were out at some, you know, professional dinner. It was probably some pharmaceutical dinner. And he wanted to tell me the story about how honey had saved this dog's life. And he had a dog that came in, and it had this horrible injury on its back. And like nobody supposedly, like, well, he never got the story on what happened to it. But anyway, it had this horrible area, this giant open wound. And he had tried everything he could to get it to heal, and it just wasn't healing. And so he finally, you know, as a last ditch effort, got his hands on some raw honey, and he slathered it over that wound, and then he bandaged it up. And amazingly, it actually healed really nicely. So they always kind of like to tell you like this success story. So, you know, we like to think about honey as having like all these great properties and being this wholesome thing. What we don't think about is that there might actually be a dark side to it. It might actually contain some things that you are not aware and certainly not intentionally consuming with that. So for a long time, we've been aware of the problem of antibiotic residues in animal products. With cattle, we think about it in, you know, the meat and milk. It's also something that we're aware of with the poultry industry, with the pork industry. Anytime that we're using antibiotics, we want to make sure that we don't end up with their residues in things we're consuming. And products made by honeybees are no different. So honey, wax, and likely other products, although I haven't yet found those to be studied in the depth that honey and wax are, because they're not as commonly used. So there's a paper that I have referenced here at the bottom, antibiotic, pesticide, and microbial contaminants of honey, human health hazards. This is actually a publicly available paper that if you just type that into your Google search, you'll be able to find it in a PDF form. And it's fairly readable. It's not super technical. And it's sort of a good read. And this paper actually came out in 2012. And as I was reading through that paper, specifically with the aspects of it that focused on antibiotics, I was really horrified to see that oxytetracycline had been found above the regulatory standards in honey. And I was even more horrified to find out that antibiotic residues have a relatively long half-life. So basically, what this means when we talk about a half-life is how long after you stop administering the antibiotic for it to basically become undetectable or for it to disappear. And residues actually can be found 290 days after dosing. And those were in overwintered colonies, which is terrible. So, you probably know that antibiotics are, we don't want to end up with residues of them, but you might not necessarily sort of understand the scope of why this is important. So when we talk about antibiotic residues, the thing that most people are aware of is that we can end up with things called antibiotic resistance. And this little image that I found here is a bacteria, and he has that little emblem on his body, SB, and that stands for superbug. So superbugs are bacteria that basically have like these superpower of being resistant to an antibiotic. So whereas normally you could give an antibiotic and it would stop the growth of the bacteria or it outright kill the bacteria, depending on the type of antibiotic, superbugs have figured out strategies for bypassing the ability of the antibiotic to kill them. And as a result, the antibiotic doesn't have much of an effect on them. In addition to that particular bacteria being a problem, if you are the unfortunate person who happens to be infected by it, superbug also has the capacity to share his knowledge with other bacteria. They actually can transmit genetic information, and so this particular bacteria has the ability to share that resistance with other bacteria, which is terrifying. So the WHO, the World Health Organization, has stated that antibiotic resistance is one of the 3 greatest threats to human health. And that's a pretty bold statement by the WHO. And there's other things that we consider to be problematic as well. So short-term exposure can cause direct toxic reactions. I'm sure that all of us have gone to the doctor and they always ask, do you have any drug allergies? And so some people actually do have true allergies that are known to various drugs, including antibiotics. They can cause allergic or hypersensitivity reactions. It can cause things like hives or like rashes or eruptions of the skin. I mean, these sound horrible, right? It sounds like the thing that you read, in your actually, that you read and then you wish you had not read when you get your medications. It's like all the side effects that can happen, but these can. And then direct toxic reactions are truly terrible. There was an antibiotic that was used, and it's actually a really great antibiotic called chloramphenicol, but they stopped using it, at least in humans, because it had the capacity in a decent number of people to really wreck your bone marrow. And the bone marrow is important because this is where our red cells come from. Most of our white cells come from there, and also little pieces of cells called platelets that are used to stop bleeding. And so it's problematic if you can't live without your bone marrow. And so in a decent proportion of people, without sort of any real rhyme or reason or, forewarning, chloramphenicol caused a lot of problems with the bone marrow in these people. And then long-term exposure, so, over, consistently being dosed by antibiotics can be carcinogenic or cancer-causing. It can cause deleterious effects on reproduction and more. And so while antibiotics are a really great drug, we want to make sure that we're using them judiciously and that we're conscious of when we're taking them in, so we aren't just kind of dosing ourselves a little bit every time we're having our, honey in our morning coffee. So now moving into the role of the veterinarian in beekeeping. I want to call your attention to this particular date. So January 1st, 2017 was a really monumentous day. And probably if if you're not a commercial beekeeper at that time, you might not have even really known, or if you aren't into animal production, you might not have even known about the significance of this date. But I bring your attention to this date because on that day, some new rules, some new laws from the FDA, the United States Food and Drug Administration, went into effect. And I'd like to point out that these are federal laws, which means that if you violate them, you are committing a felony. And I don't think that any of us want that on our record. Certainly not, certainly don't want to unintentionally, we shouldn't break the law anyway, but we don't want to unintentionally do this. So how this ended up coming about, we have to time travel just a little bit back to 2010, where the FDA started to really scrutinize the use of antibiotics in food animals, from that standpoint and making sure that we did not unintentionally end up with antibiotic residues in the feed chain. And so you can sort of see that, like, over 2011, there was a steering committee that started to really look into the use of antibiotics, and then some drafts were made, and then ultimately on January 1st, 2017, this law was implemented. And you can get a little bit more information if you go to that AVMA, the American Veterinary Medical Association.org. That website will talk a little bit more about the veterinary feed direct. So the particular rule that went into effect said that all medically important antibiotics to be used in feed or water for food animal species require a veterinary feed directive or a prescription. And I want to take just a moment here and unpack some of this statement. So all medically important antibiotics, they are, the majority of things that would be administered as an antibiotic are considered medically important. And a lot of the antibiotics that are used in food animals are the same or are very closely related to antibiotics that would be used in humans. And so you can see why, if we're worrying about things like resistance, we really don't want to end up with resistant bacteria from animals, and then that infection might be in people, and then there you are without anything to treat it. So to be used in feed and water, well, that's sort of a no-brainer. That's typically the most common way that we administer antibiotics, especially in a herd health situation. And then for food animal species, and this is where it gets a little bit interesting. So food animal species, we probably think about things like cattle and pigs and, poultry. But food animal species also has a broader scope, and things like people's cute little fluffy bunny rabbit. Rabbits are consumed for food, and so they are considered a food animal species. Honeybees are also considered a food animal species. And this circles back to where I was trying to sort of already draw the parallels and set the framework for getting you to think of bees as small cattle. And then finally, the veterinary feed directive or prescription. These are two different entities, but what I'm really going to take some time addressing is the veterinary feed directive. So the difference basically is that with a veterinary feed directive, you're going to actually go to the feed store and buy a medicated feed, as opposed to going to a pharmacy and coming home with like a bottle of tetracycline or something. So how the veterinary feed directive works is kind of interesting. So back to the cattle analogy, a farmer is going to decide that they have some condition present in their herd where they need to use a medicated feed. And so then they get together with their veterinarian and they discuss using this medicated feed. So this conversation, it's a two-way conversation. You can see that it's shown by that double-ended arrow. And it's important because there has to be a veterinary client-patient relationship. So the client is the farmer, the veterinarian is obviously the veterinarian, and then the patient, if you have like a dog or cat, it's pretty obvious to see who your patient is. But in this, it would be like the entity of the herd of cattle, or if it was one specific cow, that cow. The same thing with honeybees, it would be the superorganism of the colony, or collectively the apiary. So what doesn't happen is the farmer calls the vet and says, hey, I have this condition and I need this for it. That is not how this goes. There has to actually be that the veterinarian, from a legal standpoint, they will be liable. So they need to have that relationship to where they feel very confident in the diagnosis and also the justification for using antibiotics. So once the vet decides that this is something that's indicated, they're going to write their VFD. They keep a copy. The farmer goes off with 2 copies, gives one to the feed store, and keeps one for themselves. And so, you probably have your local feed store. If you have, cattle or something where you'd go pick up your medicated feed. But we also have, places like Man Lake, Better Bee. They also provide medicated feed, basically, so that you don't have to worry about mixing it up. So then the farmer with the medicated feed goes home, administers it, and is respectful, conscientious of the withdrawal times, and it's a win-win situation. So what are antibiotics? I just wanted to briefly review this. So antibiotics kill or stop the growth of bacteria. And antibiotics belong to a class of drugs called antimicrobials. So antimicrobials is basically an umbrella term under which falls any kind of a substance, whether it's natural, semi-synthetic, or synthetic in origin, that's going to kill or stop the growth of microorganisms, hopefully with little or no damage to the host. And microorganisms is also a bit of an umbrella term because that includes things like bacteria, of course, but things like fungus, viruses, those sorts of things. And so it follows that all antibiotics are antimicrobials, but not all antimicrobials are antibiotics. So what does this mean to you with the antibiotic use in honeybees? Well, antibiotics are used to treat bacterial infections, and the 2 that are most commonly treated are American foul brood and European foul brood. Also snot brood, which is a little bit of a, I think it's a little bit of a nebulous thing. It sort of acts like EFB, but sort of conflicting reports of whether it'll actually give a positive test result for that, but does also respond to antibiotics. Antibiotics are not used to treat mites. So Varroa destructor does not respond to antibiotics. Antibiotics are not used to treat viral infections, not used to treat deformed wing virus, not used to treat paralytic virus. And in humans, in topical news, antibiotics are also not used to treat COVID virus, not itself. Maybe some secondary infections that are bacterial, but not viruses. They're also not used to treat fungal disease, chalk brood. So if we think back to how that FDA ruling came into be, it only specified antibiotics. And so as a result, you only need your veterinarian to be involved if you're administering antibiotics to your honeybees. Anything else, whether it's treating mites, viruses we usually deal with by trying to reduce our mite load and therefore, reduce the likelihood of getting them vectored by them. You don't need a veterinarian for anything except for antibiotics. Now, some veterinarians do have a component of their practices. There are bee vets that they probably do some consulting, but that is not legally required at this point. So as typically happens, or seems to happen a lot when the government gets involved, is sometimes there's not necessarily an infrastructure in place to support the change. And so when 2017 and this ruling rolled around, a lot of veterinarians were, sort of, well, actually a lot of us didn't know about it unless you were already beekeeping. But, didn't sort of know that suddenly now these small cows, honeybees, were going to be under our jurisdiction. And so, we don't get any training, or at least we didn't get any training on honeybees when I went through veterinary school. I graduated in 2004. And it was just at that time that invertebrate medicine was starting to become trendy and the invertebrate club had formed. So, and what we saw with that was things like tarantulas and African millipedes. We weren't thinking about honeybees at that time. And why would we? Because, people, beekeepers are really good at, beekeeping, and it's an art that you learn over years, decades. To try to learn something like that in vet school, just isn't really something we did. So the Honeybee Veterinary Consortium actually formed out of response to this. And like I said earlier, they basically serve as the liaison between the veterinary community, animal science community, honey beekeepers, and also apiary inspectors. And one of the things that is done that's really exceptional is every year in September, a conference is put on that offers continuing education for veterinarians. And we have actually some pretty amazing speakers. We had Randy Oliver come one year. We had Megan Milbreth come another year. So the Honeybee Veterinary Consortium actually has a website that you can go to, the hbvc.org. And I took a screenshot uh, of a particular part of that website where you can go to locate a vet in your area. So if you should find yourself in the unfortunate situation of needing a veterinarian to come help you, you would just type in your address and see what you come up with. And I think that actually when I did this, I probably should have cropped it a little bit further to the left, shouldn't I? So that I could actually see more of your area. So this may be all that was available in North Carolina at the time. I can't remember. But if you would mouse over any of these little red balloons, you would get the contact information for those veterinarians. This simply exists to make your life a little bit easier so that you aren't scrambling trying to find a veterinarian. There are still plenty of veterinarians that will work with you for veterinary feed directives if needed that are not listed here. So this is not an exhaustive list, but it is one that's meant to make your life a little bit easier should you find yourself in that situation. So I wanted to talk a little bit about American foulbrood and European foulbrood. I feel like, you know, in bee school and, you know, and listserv and other conversations, Varroa mites sort of get all the press. They get all the you know, screen time basically, and that's true because if you don't deal with your mites, you know, there's a very high probability that you will not have your colonies overwintering. And 100% of colonies in the United States, probably, you know, for all intents and purposes, are going to have varroa mites. Not 100% are going to have AFB. AFB is caused by a spore-forming bacteria that's called Pentabacillus larvae. And this is almost always fatal to a colony if it is infected. It is extraordinarily contagious, and it doesn't discriminate between strong and weak colonies. And sort of this, herein lies the rub of AFB. It doesn't matter how incredibly strong your colonies are, if they are exposed to it, there's a very good likelihood that they will develop AFB and have to be sacrificed. And we see a lot of problems with AFB, especially sort of in that commercial pollinator livelihood. And that's where it becomes a bit of a sticky wicket as far as whether antibiotics are prophylactically given because we have so many bees moving into small areas and commingling. And I'm not even really sure, honestly, where the right answer is sort of with like the large commercial pollinators. So hopefully most of us are smaller scale and this will be applicable to you. So the problem with AFB is that it forms spores, and spores are basically dormant bacteria, a dormant form of the bacteria that is really difficult to kill because it's dormant. So they are not killed by freezing. So, you know, we might throw our combs in our chest freezers because we want to get rid of some wax moths or small hive beetles or, you know, even mites. It won't do anything for spores. They also resist chemical eradication, meaning that if you, you know, are trying to dip your hives in Clorox bleach, that's not going to be effective. So the only ways that we can really effectively get rid of AFB is to disinfect with fire or gas. So historically, if you had AFB in your apiary, you're going to be burning your hives and burning your bees and then burying that pit, which is demoralizing for so many reasons. We still can't save the bees and we still can't save the wax if you have an active AFB infection, but we can gas sterilize them. And so living in the state of North Carolina, this is a little less convenient because of sort of your geographic location. But in Raleigh, we have a chamber that that will provide gas sanitation for AFB. And my understanding of it is if you, and this might not apply as much to you because of the travel associated with getting your hiveware there, but it still might be worth it if you have a lot, is that it's pretty economical. It's not terribly expensive, and it's cheaper than buying new equipment. So just know that that exists. The downside is that they don't run the chamber until it's full of equipment. So you might find yourself having to wait a little bit before you can get your equipment back. Like it's not probably going to be, drop it off at 8 a.m. one morning and pick it up at noon. It's not dry cleaning. It doesn't work quite that quick. So I also like to mention that because spores can exist for decades on the equipment or in the environment, you really need to be careful if you're buying used equipment. Don't do what I did. So the package deal of chickens and bees, totally naive on my end of things. And thank goodness it didn't end poorly, but just be aware of it. AFB has a pretty low incidence in the United States, so 1 to 3%, but it's still a high enough incidence that most people know somebody. If you've been beekeeping long enough, you know someone who's had AFB in their apiary. It's spread by social interactions of bees, and this again gets back to the sort of problematic component of bees being completely free range. So while my apiary might not have AFB, if my bees went out and we have like a fountain in front of our house, and I call it the water cooler because the bees hang out there when it's hot, and they sort of just look like they're kind of, in addition to collecting water, they kind of look like they're just, chatting with each other. And so those social interactions, I don't know if those are all my bees, they're probably not. So there's a potential for infection. And then also it can be spread by fomites. And I love the word fomite. It's kind of a fancy word, and you might love it too after I explain it to you if you don't already know what it is. So a fomite is basically any object. It can be living or not, but it's any object that's capable of transmitting something infectious without actually getting infected by it. So topically relevant, we're all out there running around and sanitizing the handles of our grocery carts and sanitizing our groceries when we come home because we don't want to get COVID. We know that the grocery cart is not actually going to get COVID-19. It's not going to get infected by it. But we are worried that the grocery cart might be a fomite, and if an individual who had COVID before and breathed or sneezed on that handle, and then you touch it and then you touch your face, stick your finger in your mouth, which you shouldn't be doing anyway, but that has the potential to be a fomite. So AFB starts in the larval stage, but it's diagnosed in the pupal stage. And AFB and EFB, unfortunately those names are really similar, but we have a bit of a boon, a bit of a gift, in that AFB starts with the letter A, and you might think that it stands for American, and yes it does, but A also stands for after. So American foul brood is diagnosed after the larva is capped. So that A kind of gives you a good turn in helping you remember what stage of the brood cycle you would be diagnosing it in. You might open your hive up and notice that it's got sort of a sulfurous or chicken house type smell. Caveat, we're sort of out of the bloom period now, but goldenrod, when it blooms, we have quite a bit of it here in central North Carolina. It smells like a locker room. It smells like feet. And Valerie, who is my coworker and dear friend, her hives, when we went out and were opening them up, smelled like the locker room. And so she was a little bit afraid of AFB. And, the brood looked fine. I said, no, you just have goldenrod. So again, AFB being diagnosed after the larvae are capped, we see sunken cappings. So we can kind of see, that we on the right, on that, on that lower image, sort of to the right, the cappings look a little bit sort of fallen in on themselves. Sometimes you'll see, sort of like slight perforations in them. And then the easiest thing for you to do if you think that you have AFB in your apiary is to take, a pine needle or a broomstick, a broom straw or a match or something, long that you can insert into the cell, pierce the capping, give it a little stir, and withdraw it. And if you've got sort of this like stringy liquefied larva that comes out with it, there's a decently good chance that you do have AFB. There's also a commercially available test kit. There's also one for EFB, and I'll talk about those when I get onto EFB. If you have AFB, you need to call your apiary inspector. And I did a quick search to see who your apiary inspector was, and it's Lewis Cobble. I've heard so much about him. I hope I actually get to meet him in person one day. And for us in Central North Carolina, it's Nancy Rupert. So you always want to make sure that you call your apiary inspector. This is a reportable disease in the state of North Carolina. That's how bad it is. And what's going to happen if you have AFB and it's confirmed with your apiary inspector, they're going to help, they're going to do actually quite a bit of legwork and try to warn other beekeepers in the area that we have a case of AFB, and they're going to help those beekeepers prevent their colonies from getting infected. So whereas if you are the unfortunate individual who actually has a fulminant case of it in your apiary, you can't really do a lot. Like you can't get rid of the spores. You're kind of you're stuck with eradicating those bees, unfortunately. However, if you know that it's out there, antibiotics can be given to stop the bacteria before they get to that spore stage and protect them. And I just want to make a little mention here that sometimes, there's a little bit of a stigma associated with it. Like you don't want to be the person that has AFB. And I'll tell you, you didn't do anything wrong. If you happen to have AFB in your apiary, you didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes bad luck happens. It's really important to sort of swallow that fear of judgment and call your apiary inspector. All right, so EFB is caused by the bacterium Melissococcus plutonius. It does not form spores, and that is a blessing. Because it does not form spores, it's much easier to get rid of. But I do want to mention that it can be associated with old drawn comb, at least anecdotally. And this is a plug for you all to be getting rid of drawn comb on a regular basis from your hives. So about 4 years is about as long as you want to keep the comb around, and then you really need to be getting rid of it. You can keep the frame, if you have plastic foundation, you can, scrape it off and let them start again. But you want to make sure that you're getting rid of that old drawn comb. There's other things, obviously, that we know about. So drawn comb is also notorious for getting pesticide or miticide, like apivar residues collecting in it. It's just a good practice to get rid of that drawn comb regularly. And EFB is a lot easier to get rid of from your colony unless there's some other predisposing factor that caused the colony to be weakened. So because of that, we typically see EFB rearing its head during times of food shortage. Antibiotics, of course, administered, written by your veterinarian, can be used to get rid of EFB. And there's also some other methods, and I'll actually talk about one of those later this evening. It's my plug to get you to keep paying attention because it doesn't always require that. So EFB has an incidence of 3 to 5% in the US, and I have a big question mark with that because even though that incidence is published, I honestly wonder if it's not a little bit higher than that. Just like AFB, EFB is spread by social interactions of bees and fomites, and of course remember that fomites are things that can transmit a infection without actually being infected by it. And EFB also does us a good turn in its name. So you think that the E stands for European, and it does. But E also stands for early. And this particular infection infects young larvae before they are capped, so early in the developmental stage. And I need to make a small side note here and give credit where credit is due. I am not so very smart to come up with the after and the early bit. This was actually taught to me by our apiary inspector, Nancy Rupert. So credit where credit is due. So again, EFB is diagnosed in the young larvae before they're capped. And most commonly what you'll see is a discolored larvae that'll be sort of like a brown to caramel color, tan. In health, larvae should be nothing but purest, pristine, most, pure white. They should not be discolored any other color. And they should be swimming in some quantity of royal jelly that should also be pure white. Seeing larvae that are anything other than white is not normal and warrants further investigation. It may or may not have a smell associated with it. That's not really as reliable as it is with AFB. And there's also a test kit that you can use. So these test kits, they exist for both AFB and EFB, and they are specific to the particular bacteria that you're testing for. So if you think you have AFB, you should use the AFB test kit. If you think you have EFB, you should use the EFB test kit. These are readily available at bee supply stores. Last check, they were available on Amazon. But I want to just mention, if you look in that lower left corner of that package, it has an expiration date on there. And yes, indeed, these tests do expire. So you probably don't want to be banking a whole bunch of them, thinking just in case. It probably is easier if you think that you have a case of it to then buy the test kit, depending, I guess, on how long it takes to get purchases delivered to you, or if there's a local bee store. So I wanted to give a little bit of a guidance in when to call the veterinarian. And spoiler alert, stealing my own thunder, a veterinarian's visit is not always needed, even if you have AFB or EFB in your apiary. Now, if you think you have AFB, you really need to be calling your apiary inspector. They want to know about this. And side note, apiary inspectors, gosh, they're phenomenal people, but our tax money goes to pay for them. So there's not, a separate charge associated with it. And they really, apiary inspectors, at least the ones that I've interacted with, are extraordinarily dedicated to the health and welfare of honeybees and the industry. So, they want to help you. So deciding when to call. The first thing would be whether or not you think that you have AFB or EFB in your apiary. If you do, you need to call your apiary inspector. They'll come out for EFB, but most decidedly, if you think that it's AFB, please call. If you think that it's anything other than AFB or EFB, you do not need to call the veterinarian because, again, we are not required for the treatment or diagnosis of other pests like mite, viral, fungal, or anything else that might be the ills of your bees. If AFB is confirmed, and usually by that little test that I showed you, you want to call your apiary inspector, and they are going to work with you and a veterinarian to address the problem and minimize further transmission. Now, again, if you have it in your apiary and those colonies that are infected are going to have to be sacrificed, and appropriate, the hiveware dealt with appropriately, either burning or gas sterilization. But the veterinarians are going to help to, and the apiary inspector will reach out to other beekeepers in the area. Veterinarians, usually with a veterinary feed directive, are going to work with those other beekeepers to help minimize the likelihood of AFB also infecting their bees. If EFB is confirmed, you need to decide if you're going to treat with antibiotics. So if you do, then you're going to need your vet to work together with you and write out a VFD or a prescription, the veterinary feed directive. However, I'd like to ask that you first consider the return on your investment and whether there were any underlying causes that might have contributed to EFB, because EFB is, again, typically an opportunistic type infection. So as far as the return on investment, and I'm sorry, I don't actually know like a specific cost that, like what a vet would charge, but I think, you could probably reason it out, in some ways along the lines of this. If you're going to call a vet out, they're going to charge you a farm call, right? Like you're going to pay for their trip to see you. You're probably then also going to pay for their time once they are at your apiary or farm, probably an hour minimum. On top of that, you're probably going to have to pay for the prescription, or maybe some diagnostics or something else like that. And then you're still going to be left with having to actually purchase this medicated feed. So if you have, one colony that's infected, it's really, kind of, and this is where I get into, my sort of love of production animal medicine. I love my bees. I've named queens before. It's not uncommon for me to name queens or know personalities of them, or like little cute anecdotes about, the various colonies we have. But notwithstanding, they still, for me, are a food animal. And so to determine, a lot of us don't really, you know, like throwing our wallet into, you know, black pit on a regular basis. So you've got to decide, would it just be cheaper to start over? You know, and what sits well with you. And then the other thing that I want to, again, bring up is that this is largely an opportunistic type of infection. So what was it that caused your bees to become infected with EFB to begin with? So this circles back to whether you plan to treat with antibiotics. So if you're not, then you want to choose some other option to address EFB, which doesn't always necessarily have to mean that you're going to sacrifice your colony, because remember, AFB you are, EFB not so contagious. If you have other robust colonies, it's very unlikely that they're going to have a problem from one other colony in the area that is infected. All right, so I'm going to hop off this for just a second and take a look and see. Actually, now would be a good time to stop for questions if you'd like, and I'll stop sharing for just a moment before I get into my case study so that I can see if there are any, there we go, anything in the chat. There's nothing in the chat. All right, any questions so far?
I have a question. Would honeybee healthy be considered medication?
It's not. It's like a nutraceutical because it's got like that, what, the spearmint in it. No, that's not considered. I mean, I think it's considered a nutraceutical.
Oh, what about commercial pollen?
I don't think so. From like an actual like a medication standpoint, I don't think so.
Okay, thank you, Rebekah.
Yeah, no problem. Anybody else?
Rebekah.
Yes.
This is Debbie. What about nosema? Isn't nosema sometimes treated with some sort of antibiotic?
So, oh gosh, and then it wasn't available, right? So it's it's coming back. Fumagellin, is that right?
Yes, it's fumagellin.
So, but
that's my understanding.
Yeah, but nosema is not a bacteria. It's like a little sort of, I guess it's been reclassified as being a fungus. So at this point in the game, I think that I think it was called fumagellin. I know that it was unavailable for a while, but I heard that it was coming back, that particular drug. But that being that it's a fungus, we don't worry about residues of that in the food chain, so that does not require a veterinarian. That's a good question.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And good question about the nutraceuticals too. All right, so let me hop back on and share my screen again, and we'll come back. Whoops. There we are. All right, so my case study. There's nothing like experience of your own to really give you some important lessons. So just a little bit of a background on our apiary. We run Langstroths. We run 10-frame Langstroths, usually with 2 deep brood chambers, but we've kind of experimented with like deeps and singles and, deeps and mediums, and not, you know, super attached to either one yet. We're still kind of playing around with it, and it sometimes depends, you know, on, to be honest, what hiveware we happen to have available when we need it. So in 2019, we had 11 colonies, and we sort of named them all, and we're pretty vigilant about naming our colonies and also performing regular checks on them. So 2019, and you know, in November, we buttoned everybody up and, you know, made sure they had all their resources. And out of our 11 colonies, 10 overwintered. We just up and lost one, like it, you know, it dead out. So spring of 2020, we had 10 of these 11 colonies overwinter. And this particular colony had their numbers contract down so much last fall, like they still looked okay, there just weren't a ton of them, that we, you know, pushed them down into a single deep because we didn't want them to have that excess real estate that's a liability. So they overwintered, and they were kind of strange. Like they were really slow to come out of the gate. So the other 9 colonies came out of the gate booming, like having to do early splits and still contending with swarms, and basically like the size of our apiary exploded. So, those other 9 were very prolific. They were doing what they should do. But then there was this one, colony R2, that just didn't really do very well. Like they just kind of muddled along. They didn't really have any perceptible difference that we could tell. They had the same resources. We had given everybody supplemental feeding. I don't feel very comfortable in my own ability yet to really, make sure that they have enough resources to overwinter. So basically in our apiary, everybody gets a candy board or sugar brick, or, it's sort of all names for the same thing. The mite counts were low. When we're in an active brood rearing time, my husband and I do alcohol washes every 2 to 3 weeks on our colonies, and their mite counts were really low. So they were just kind of this poor doer, and that we didn't really understand why. And perhaps also as a bit of a, your season runs a little bit behind ours. And so while May 15th might look like things are really starting to get rocking and rolling, by May 15th, our nectar flow is basically done. And if a colony isn't going to really get up and going, they're not gonna. So we were sort of left scratching our heads of why. So we're out there and we start to inspect this particular colony. And we pulled out a frame and it looked like this. And so here's where the interactive part of tonight's portion of the entertainment comes in. So I would love if you would like to unmute, tell me what do you think of this frame of brood?
It's clearly spotty.
And you might need to say it a little bit louder. It's clearly spotty, yes. Are we happy with this? No. What else?
I see
Maybe you need a new queen.
No, this doesn't look like a queen issue. I see some, the brood that's open doesn't all look very, very healthy. I see some dark brood.
Good.
I see some slumping brood.
Good.
I also don't see any honey at all, any resources on that frame.
Right, good. Anything else? Good. Excellent.
Of course, you may have shaken this off, but there aren't even any nurse bees hanging out, really.
That's right. It was the strangest thing. Like there weren't that many bees. Like they kind of contracted down for the winter and then they never really did much. But I agree in saying it's not a queen issue as far as her ability to lay. So she was laying pretty appropriately. I see, there's a couple in that upper left and then sort of far left. There looks like there's a couple of drone cells maybe thrown in worker cells, which sometimes that happens and doesn't mean anything. But if you see a lot of that, sometimes that means that, the queen is lacking in her fertility. She might be running out of sperm or not well mated. But it's just kind of a strange pattern. So we've got this capped brood without any sort of like real rhyme or reason. Like normally when they eclose, when the bees come out, like you should see a pretty orderly pattern to it, and we don't. If you were to look at a higher magnification, you would see some of the things that have already been mentioned, which is that the brood is discolored and brown, it's slumping. The cappings don't look particularly sunken. They kind of look okay, but the brood itself just doesn't look right. And it also looks a little slimy, kind of snotty. And then to the point, there really weren't that many nurse bees, and then there really aren't that many resources. There were some frames that were a bit better as far as honey, but there just weren't. And I think that, that kind of speaks to the fact that there weren't that many sort of workers they just didn't have that much, bee power as far as gathering resources and doing sort of, the allotted division of duties. So then we looked a little bit closer and you can see that we've got some twisted larvae that look like they're melting. And so at about this point, I was pretty well horrified because on this particular day, I was wearing my leather gloves to inspect, and I thought to myself, I don't think that this is AFB, but if it is, like, like, I can't, like, there's no way that I can sanitize my gloves. And I still had, like, we still had probably like 6 more colonies to inspect. So at that point, my husband and I kind of buttoned it back up, and I think we went inside and like cleaned everything up and, you know, took off the gloves. And since that time, I actually don't wear leather gloves anymore. My husband doesn't wear gloves. I wear nitrile gloves. Those can also be like discarded, and, you know, if you need to do a quick change if you think that there might be an infected colony. So at that point, being a veterinarian, when I try to troubleshoot things, I sometimes find it easiest to phrase it in terms of a problem list. So first and foremost, we have this colony that's just a poor doer. It's just, you know, didn't really do what it was supposed to do. You know, it didn't really make a lot of sense. It was a fairly young queen. She's present. She's clearly laying. We had met their nutritional needs as best we could. I mean, I'm sure that you all have all experienced those colonies that you try to feed and they just don't take the food, even though they seem to need it. And it just is a head scratcher. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. The mite counts were low. So that didn't really make a lot of sense. You know, maybe the mite counts were low in part because there wasn't that much capped brood. And then you know, there's various ways that we could describe that pattern, but I like to call it shot brood. It looks like somebody unloaded a shotgun on it. And probably one of the most useful talks that I actually went to during the Honeybee Veterinary Consortium was Randy Oliver's talk on reading the frames. And that really started to make me kind of like look, you know, not so much at like the individual areas of it, but more globally when we're pulling out those frames and looking at them. So then also, you know, on top of that, we've got the larvae are discolored and brown, and they look kind of melted or snotty, but the cappings aren't sunken. And this was sort of like the one thing that made me feel slightly better about life at that point, which was that it probably wasn't AFB, but I didn't feel 100% sure about that. So basically my husband and I, we came back in the house and we're like, okay, something's wrong. We've got the problem list. So now what do we do? And so we, you know, kind of had some options that I came up with. You know, one, I guess you could just ignore it. I mean, eventually something will happen. It would probably, like, the colony will probably just die off. But that didn't, you know, seem like such a great idea in the, you know, off chance that it was AFB. And then I have torch it, and I don't actually literally mean torch it. Of course, I would if I thought that it was AFB, but by torch it, I mean you could just euthanize the colony. That is not that easy of a feat to do. I have had one other colony that we had to euthanize, and it was not fun. So the other option is to call in the expert, call in someone who is more experienced than you. And so that is what I ended up doing. So I sent an email to my apiary inspector, and by like 2 days later, she was standing there in our apiary with me. And so on the right, that's me. I look like a Stay Puft Marshmallow in my outfit. And then on the left, we have Nancy Rupert, who always looks svelte and completely competent and totally on top of things. So she came out and spent some time going through the colony with us from, of course, a safe distance because this was COVID times. And she said, you know, basically, yes, I think that this is EFB, but let's do a test to confirm it. So she did the test, and it came up with 2 lines, which means that it's positive. And she had some extra test kits in her truck. And so since she knows that I'm a veterinarian and that, you know, likely at some time in my life, I will be called upon in someone else's apiary to help them out with a similar issue, she let my husband and I play around with another test, which not surprisingly also came up positive. And then it was kind of a funny thing. So I have a girlfriend of mine lives in Raleigh, and she's also a beekeeper. She's not a vet. She's a beekeeper and longtime friend. And so I had been talking about, you know, like, as probably you all do as well, like you talk sometimes about like the woes of your apiary as the hive turns. And so I had sent her a little text and just sent a picture. And I didn't feel like I needed to caption it because I thought it was really self-explanatory. I mean, I'm out in my apiary. I've got my positive result sitting on top of my hive. Well, I sent that to her and, you know, went on about my way and didn't think about it. And then she texted me because she thought that congratulations were in order. So there's actually the same it's called an ELISA test, an enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay. It's the same testing methodology that's used for pregnancy tests. So if you should find yourself feeling that you would like to share your EFB test on, like, social media or something, you should probably caption it, because otherwise you'll end up with congratulations. So yes, we were having EFB. So that's my comic relief. So once we got our diagnosis confirmed, then we really had to make some decisions about what to do about it. And it's a proven fact that if you ask 3 different beekeepers what to do, you're going to get 6 different answers, usually all in like the same conversation. So we could have continued to ignore it, but that, usually doesn't, that wouldn't fix this problem. It would eventually end up with the colony probably just dying out. Make sure the nutritional needs are met, and honestly, we had done that. I mean, we'd been through a decent nectar flow. There really wasn't that much more we could do there. In some cases, if you've got EFB in your colonies because, you're in a dearth or something, or the weather's really bad, or maybe it was like, a colony that's just kind of trying to get off the ground, sometimes just feeding them will turn around EFB. We had the option of euthanizing the colony, but there were probably about 20,000, 30,000 bees, maybe. It didn't look like it from that picture, but there actually were. It was more bees in it than looked like, and that, both from a practical standpoint, it's not that easy to euthanize a colony. When I have done it before, it basically involves like a large container, like we actually used the same container that we use for our alcohol washes, and we filled it with detergent, soapy detergent water, and just shook frame after frame into it. So from a practical standpoint, it's kind of challenging. And then, from sort of the, emotional standpoint, it's really demoralizing. We wouldn't be putting this much work into raising these bees if we didn't love them. So the 2 options that I really took to heart were whether to give the colony antibiotics or whether to try a shook swarm. And, sort of like the standard that we typically think about is giving antibiotics because you can, but we didn't choose that. And there were a couple reasons why. So the colony itself is not really all that big, but even more than that, it kind of goes back to wondering what the underlying predisposing factor was that caused them to become infected with EFB to begin with. So, we said it's not a queen problem as far as the laying, but I actually did wonder if maybe there was something about her genetics not being all that great. And I'd like to mention that last winter, when we did lose that one colony overwintering, that was the same genetics as this particular one. I think it was like R colony, and this was R2, because like for a while we were actually able to like trace the lineage of our bees back to who the queens were that we'd taken the splits from, which was important because we last year had both Italians and Russians, and now everything's basically hybridized. So anyway, so that was why we decided not to give antibiotics. I also spoke to Nancy Rupert, who again is our local apiary inspector, and she said that in her experience, antibiotics sort of are like slapping a Band-Aid on something without actually really fixing the problem. So what we decided to do instead was a popular management technique in Europe called a shook swarm. Has anybody heard of a shook swarm? Cool. All right, good. So maybe I'll teach you something new. So a shook swarm is basically a way of getting rid of EFB and oops, in the colony. So we're going to get rid of the underlying cause, and we're going to get rid of anything that's harboring Melissococcus, which again is the name of the bacteria that causes EFB. And then we're going to save as many of the bees as we can. I'll also mention that this is a very popular management practice in Europe because there are some areas where it's not legal to give antibiotics. So they basically have to deal with these diseases without using antibiotics. So with the shook swarm, we're going to keep the workers because we need to use them as the workforce to establish a new colony. We'll keep the drones just because, they're along for the ride, sort of as they always are. But we're going to get rid of the queen because, again, I question her genetics. We're going to get rid of the brood because it's harboring EFB. And then, of course, with that, we need to get rid of all of that comb that's harboring EFB. And again, a plug for periodically changing out your wax foundations. So what are we going to then give them? Well, we need to give them all, new, or at least new to them, hive and components. You can definitely reuse this hiveware. I would do it after freezing it for a period of time. And since you do a shook swarm all at once, it does mean that you need to have a totally new set of hiveware available. We then, because we run Langstrasse, we gave them, I can't remember if it was 7 or 8, anyway, frames with undrawn foundation. You're going to give them 2 or 3 frames that have brood from some strong colony, which we had. You're going to then put on a feeder and syrup because the bees are now going to be called upon to draw out that foundation. And then plus or minus a queen. So, you can either, you might have another queen that, needs a colony. You might want to purchase a queen, or you might let them raise their own. And that's what we chose to do. So I'll show you how the actual shook swarm works. So the first thing that you do is you dispatch the queen. And this jar, you might wonder exactly like, why is this person putting queens in a jar? Well, that jar has isopropyl alcohol in it. And much like alcohol is the vehicle for perfumes and colognes that ladies and gentlemen wear, it also can be a vehicle for queen pheromone. So the idea with this is that in the spring, what I'll do is take a cotton ball and dip it in this wonderful queen pheromone perfume, and then put it in my swarm trap with the hopes of encouraging swarms to come and reside in there. So let no good queen go to waste, even if she's of no longer of service in your apiary. So then we basically set up our Langstrasse hive with our foundation frames in it, not putting the brood in yet because you don't want to worry about it chilling. And then you just start shaking. You shake all the bees that you can off of your frames. And then once you've shaken all of the bees off, you button it up with your feeder. I like hive top feeders. There's obviously many other types of feeders that you could use, with your sugar syrup, a light sugar syrup, and let them go. For us, we wait like 4 weeks if we're letting them raise their own queen to make sure that she's gotten well mated and is accepted and had a chance to start laying. So with all this being said and done, my husband and I, congratulated ourselves and patted ourselves on the back and said, the end, which it actually wasn't. So this wonderful queen who had started laying beautifully, like completely full combs or, frames of brood, with no trace of EFB, rewarded our fine efforts by swarming one day. We were actually out in the apiary when this happened. And so after quickly making sure that my husband's life insurance policy was up to date and paid off, he then scurried up into the sweet gum tree and retrieved the swarm for us. So sometimes bees do what bees are going to do in spite of our finest efforts. And that is now the end of the story. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and come back on with my video because it's just a little bit friendlier when we can see each other's faces, and see if you have any follow-up questions for me.
Excellent, Rebekah. Thank you. If you wouldn't mind transferring host back to me, I'd appreciate that.
Oh, yes. The last task.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That was great. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome. Do you want to change the host? Yes. There you go.
Perfect. Thank you.
You're so welcome.
Interesting presentation.
So my first response to this is, whoa, this was great. I learned a lot of new things tonight about European foul brood and American foul brood, and just, it's funny. I'd heard someone else before say bees are like cows, and first time I heard that, I was like, what? And then their response was, it's like livestock. And what they said was, you wouldn't go out and buy a calf and then just turn it loose and never pay attention to it. You would feed it, you'd water it,
Yeah.
you'd make sure it was taken care of properly, you had shelter and that sort of stuff. So why would you ever buy a box of bees and then just stick them somewhere and then never pay attention to them? So that was my introduction into bees or cows. But yes, this was excellent. I have to say I was a little bit nervous that it might be a little too technical and too medical, but I thought you were spot on, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Good. I'm so glad. This feedback is really helpful for me. And I always feel like when I give these talks, like I end up learning so much. And like every time that I give this lecture, it's a little bit better because people give me feedback, which I really, really appreciate. And your experience. I mean, I'm well aware that we're 4 years into beekeeping, and there is a steep learning curve associated with it. Second year, we managed to kill all of our colonies. But we're not easily stopped, so we just kept pressing forward. But I feel like it's just something where you keep learning, and bees will always keep surprising you. And the more that people share their knowledge, the more we learn from each other.
Absolutely. I've been keeping bees. I'm sorry, Debbie, what was that?
I was just going to say, Rebekah, I really enjoyed that. I especially liked the saving of the doomed queens in the alcohol. I've never heard that before, but that's a great idea.
It is, and I have to give credit where credit is due. That was also a Nancy Rupert idea. So credit where credit's due. But yes, that, and then those old combs that you're pulling out, supposedly if you put a little piece of one of those in your swarm trap, that will also help to draw the bees in. Because bees, I mean, as we know, like bees get really interested by smelling where other bees have been. Like you can see it, like we have a lot of hiveware in our garage, and even if there's not really anything on it, they still kind of inspect it.
That's cool.
Does anybody have any questions that you'd like to ask Rebekah while we've got her on the line still? I warn you now, you're being recorded if you do, and this will all go into our YouTube.
You could also chat them to me, and then I won't say your name for the right price.
Well, if there aren't any more questions, I'm going to let Rebekah go and stop the recording here. Again, Rebekah, thank you